So without further ado, let me welcome James to the virtual stage. James, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Allison. I very much appreciate the chance to talk to you folks today. I'm going to basically be talking about a report called Pathways to Net Zero, a decision support tool that was put out by the Transition Accelerator in January of this year, so it's just a couple of months old, and I'm the lead author of that report. I'll start with the very simple question, why did we prepare this report? Well, essentially, we wanted to look at pathway options for Canada moving towards net zero over the coming decades. And it's really intended as a kind of working tool for those who take decisions related to net zero GHG emissions. And this means government, but of course it means decision makers in the private sector as well. I should say that part of the context from our point of view is frustration with a lot of the debate that we've had over the past 10, 15 years or more, which has focused on pipelines and pricing very largely. They are important questions, but they're not really at the heart of the issue of how to address climate change and particularly how to assure transition towards net zero. And we feel very much that it's time for the government, but I suppose this applies also to the many entities in the private sector, to kind of stop muddling along and waiting to see what's going to turn up, and instead actively engage with this and try and get, if you like, ahead of the curve. So what makes this report different? Essentially, I would argue that it's because of the two lenses which we bring to bear on the issue, which I'll explain in just a minute. One is a transition lens, and the second is an energy systems analysis or an energy systems approach. The methodology was a deep dive into the literature and consultation with many Canadian and international experts. And I would say that our emphasis is that in this space, we now need more analysis rather than just modeling about possibilities. And just to mention at the beginning, the sector coverage is power, transport, buildings, oil and gas, mining, cement, agri-food, and we'll be releasing another batch of sectors probably in the next 2 months or so. Sorry, I'm just jumping around a bit. So a good starting point is ask our question, what do we mean by net zero? And this may be clear for everybody right at the beginning already, but I think it's worth just going over quickly. So essentially, very simply, it means that we get to a point when any residual greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by greenhouse gas removals, hence net zero. Of course, it becomes more complicated because you can ask questions about, do we include just carbon or all greenhouse gases? Are we talking about a company or a province or a country or the world and so on? In this report, we essentially focus on Canada as a whole, and we include all greenhouse gases. I think it's important to say right at the beginning that net zero changes everything. So what do I mean? So many years ago, more than 20 years ago, the IPCC made it clear that if you want to solve climate change, you have to squeeze greenhouse gas emissions out of the system virtually completely. But it was only recently that the kind of net zero idea made its way officially into international agreements and has been recently endorsed by the government of Canada. And once you say that, then you are explicitly saying this is not about incremental emissions reductions. It's about getting to a point where there are no longer emitting fossil fuels being used. This means no end-use natural gas for home heating. This means no gasoline and diesel for cars. And it means a lot of other changes throughout the energy system. However, so once you say that, you're no longer in the business of, oh, we need 3% within a decade, or no, it should be 11%. You're in, how do we change the systems so that we have no GHG emissions, or at least no net GHG emissions. But the second thing I would say is that in practice, achieving net zero means working to get as close to actual zero as you can get in each sector. Why is this? This is because negative emissions technologies or approaches that include everything from direct air capture to planting lots of forests are highly uncertain. We don't know how much of them we can do. We don't know which will be practical and impractical, how much they will cost, and how permanent is the stuff that we kind of bury in the ground or get absorbed by trees. So in practice, what that means is that what we need to think about is getting as close to zero emissions in each sector. So one of the things that you will see often today in discussions of net zero, that companies are planning on buying offsets to meet a large part of their net zero commitments. The problem is as Canada and the world moves towards net zero, there will be less and less offsets to buy because everybody will have this target. So the only things you will ultimately buy are actually negative emissions, but it's still extremely uncertain what these will be. So I said a couple of minutes ago that we look at two lenses that this report brings to bear on the issue, and I'll say just a few words about each of these. Firstly, a transition lens. So this is really developed from the study of how societies go through large transitions in what we call socio-technical systems. So these are things like the electricity system or the agri-food system and so on. So we've gone through lots of these. Think about electrification of society, the change from horses to automobiles and so on. If you use this lens to the climate change problem, a couple of things come right out. The first one is that getting to net zero requires fundamental adjustment or transition in multiple systems of social provisioning. We're in the habit of talking about the energy transition or the net zero transition. Yes, that's true. But of course, what we're really talking about is a transition in the way we move people and goods. So it's about transport, the way we grow our food. It's about agri-food, the way our cities are organized, and so on. And the truth is, most ordinary people don't care so much about energy unless they're in the energy business. They care about the services energy provides, like how their house is heated, how do they get to work, and so on. So it's important to think about this as a series of changes in major societal systems, not just an energy problem. Each of these systems has distinct dynamics, obstacles, enabling factors. Change in agri-food is just really different than rolling out electric vehicles. And in the Canadian context, because of the size and scale of our country and its political decentralization, we need to think about regions. So this is really an issue of sectors and regions. And yes, it's a question for the whole economy, but the pathways will be different depending on where you are and what sector you're dealing with. And finally, it's important to say that the change is not just about climate, because over the 20 or 30 years that we're moving towards net zero, there are all sorts of independent transformations that will be taking place in these systems. Think about in automobiles, for example, it's not just about electric cars, but it's about new modes of car ownership. It's about interconnected and autonomous vehicles that is going to disrupt this sector independent of the climate change agenda. And since the changes in these systems are so big and people generally want improved systems, we need to think about this not just as an emissions reduction problem, but how do we build better transport systems, better, more livable cities, a more resilient food system, as well as systems that are net zero. Other lens I mentioned was an energy systems lens. And here, the question that we really start from is, how does our energy system work today and how could it look in the future? So this is a kind of schematic energy view of our current energy system. I'm not going to discuss it in detail, but I would urge you to go and look at the report. But right away, you can see 75% of our energy essentially comes from fossil fuels today. The little clouds show how much greenhouse gas emissions and where they come from. So you can right away see a quarter from the oil and gas extraction section, another quarter from transport, which is mainly gasoline and diesel, and then 10, 12% or so from the other major sections. But this then helps us think about what this system could look like in the future. Kind of schematic diagram of a net zero emission energy system. And again, I don't have time to go through all the elements, but right away you can see electricity takes a much bigger role. A lot of end uses, such as light duty vehicles, will shift to electricity. We need things like hydrogen or other net zero fuels for industrial sectors that are hard to decarbonize. And it can also be a storage medium for renewables, perhaps home heating. The oil and gas sector has dramatically shrunk, and what's left of that sector has to be with carbon capture and storage and offsets. And then what you can't see so well in this diagram is dramatic transformation in the end use sectors, where transport, light duty transport, will be electrified. We may use fuel cells for heavy duty trucks. Building heating will be done differently, and changes in the large industrial sectors like cement and steel making and so on. So the little box on the right lists key decarbonization tasks, which means decarbonize the electricity generation and expand supply, perhaps double or more. Deploy net zero fuels, enhance efficiency, so we need less supply, address non-energy emissions, explore carbon renewal technologies, and so on. So in this report, we explore pathways to net zero. I've put up on the screen a short definition of what we mean by pathways. The key thing I think here is that the pathway is not a trend line of reducing emissions over time, but it's the sequence of changes to business practices, policy, public attitudes, regulatory measures, and so on, that one requires to achieve a systems change in the particular sector. So pathways are useful because they help us identify, they link the future with the present with the future, identify the direction of change, obstacles that may be in the way, and so on. Particularly important is to avoid dead-end pathways. So these are things that might look good today, and we say, hey, we can get rid of our 10% of our emissions if we do that, but actually cannot get us to where we need to be in several decades, which is net zero. And actually, they represent a waste of money, investment, effort, and time. And I'm happy to give other examples, but the most obvious one is biofuels for light-duty vehicles, where we're blending ethanol and gasoline. We've increased the percentage, and governments have kind of boasted about, oh, we're reducing carbon emissions. This is a pointless effort. We cannot replace all of the gasoline in current vehicles with biofuels. There's not enough land. We have other uses for that land. Electrification is the way that the world is deciding to go for light-duty vehicles, and that's where we should be putting our investment dollars. Each of the sectors, each of the sections in this report, gives a kind of qualitative analysis of where the sector is, what disruptive currents are flowing through it, what's happening now, and then an assessment of different elements that could contribute to pathways, building pathways going forward. And I'll just show you, this is kind of the summary page for light-duty vehicles, where you see the emissions they make, the options for decarbonization, what stage of transition they're in. So is it emergence or diffusion or realignment? What the problem is today, opportunities and concerns, priorities for action, and so on. And we do this for each sector. We also detailed assessment criteria of the various pathway elements. And these are the criteria that we use: technological maturity, economic cost, and so on. I guess the one right in the center is the net zero potential, by which we mean, can it be part of a net zero economic system? Is it a necessary step to get there, or a change accelerant that can help us get there? And then we look at some of the benefits that can come with this technology or approach, or other costs and so on. Here's an example of an assessment table from the report. Here we're looking at light-duty vehicles. Down the left-hand side, you have a series of options like battery electric, hydrogen fuel cell, and so on. And then we assess across all those criteria that I presented in the previous slide. And we've thrown in a color coding just to be kind of blunt, if you like. So obviously, I'm not going to go through all this. I do encourage you to look at the report, but just for example, at the far right-hand side, we say just how much of a priority should this be. So for battery electric, we say extremely high. That is the way light-duty vehicles are going. More than that, if Canada wishes an auto industry more than about a decade out, it had better be investing it massively in building an electric vehicle value chain in Canada, because these are being built out internationally, and who will be a player and who won't is being decided in the next 5 years, a decade at the absolute outset. And of course, this technology is critical for vehicle automation, robotization, and all sorts of industries in the coming century. The contrast with this in the bottom right-hand corner is ethanol blended with gasoline, which we give a red card to for the reasons that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So here is a kind of summary, an example of it. We condense everything down to these postage-sized summaries for the sectors, including how much emissions they account for, what stage of the transition, that's the little color box, and what are the priorities that need to be done for these things. Now, what you will see is that power, light-duty vehicles, buildings are the most advanced sectors, and we have the technologies now, and it's a question of rolling them out and applying them at scale. The oil and gas is a particular problem because it's the sector that's, bears a disproportionate, it's burning fossil fuels that is a disproportionate part of the problem. So it's a rather special sector about how to address it and what can be done. But ultimately, it has to be transitioned onto a net zero trajectory, which means not exporting bitumen. It means all extraction activities must be net zero, but ultimately it means moving towards the production of net zero fuels through, for instance, hydrogen and so on. Agri-food is a good example of a sector that is very difficult. It's fragmented. The emissions are mainly process emissions. They're not energy use emissions. We know things that you can do, but the whole pathways of the transition are not yet so clear. This is just a slide that kind of arrays the sectors out to show you where they are. Power, as I mentioned, is the most advanced. We just know lots of ways to make electricity other than burning coal or gas. And if one wishes a rapid and cost-effective transition, one should accelerate the decarbonization of power as much as possible. And then the real challenge becomes incrementally growing out the system to meet the new needs as transport and other sectors are transferred onto it. Yeah, I think that kind of speaks for itself. I'm not going to go into individual sectors now, but I'm happy in the questions to discuss particular sectors, cement, particularly industries, and so on. Going forward, we are planning to extend and deepen the analysis in this report. We're adding more sectors. We will be increasing policy profiles, in other words, what more targeted measures for each sector, scorecards on how governments are doing, and periodic updates. We are sure that you will look at this and say, oh my God, they've completely, their assessment of modular nuclear reactors is completely wrong or whatever. We're aware there may be mistakes, and we're happy to have a dialogue about them. But really, we want to push this discussion, and where it goes on the political sphere. And so if I was talking to politicians and deputy ministers today, I would say Canada needs to sharpen and focus on priorities and not think it can kind of muddle on and do a little bit of everything. But there is an aspect of that, a message that goes towards the investment community. The future, to build the future, the most effective and profitable, I suggest, way to do it is not spread your investment like peanut butter over a big piece of bread and hope to come out winners. There are clear pathways and trajectories where Canada has enormous economic potential and opportunities, and that will work to bring emissions down, but we have to pick those and invest in them now. Thank you.
James, you've managed to condense down a huge amount of information and analysis into just this thumbnail for us, and I appreciate that very much. I think it's these, just helping us focus in on the key sectors and giving us a bit of a vision for how those might evolve with the climate agenda, but beyond as well. And I think that's very valuable. I think a lot of people that I've spoken to have been simply baffled when you read these statistics coming out of the pandemic that has virtually shut down, say, all global travel, air travel and vehicle travel, all these sorts of trips and things, and have reduced so much. And yet we see that this has only reduced greenhouse gas emissions last year by something like 5% or 7%. And I think your report helps us to understand exactly the reason why. That at the very heart, it's not about maybe all those small individual things, but it's about the system at the core. And I think that's very hard for if individual firms or financial firms to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to break that down and figure out how we're going to put this into our longer term strategy? What risk does this pose to us as things move on? So I think this report does a great job at unpacking and decoupling. And I was just going to look through and see, I don't see specific questions yet about the sectors coming from the audience. So why don't we do this? Why don't we transition to Peter? Because I think he's going to do some work here to try to attach this a little more or a little bit now to the financial sector, help us understand what the government might do. The government can do a lot of things. It's not just fiscal measures. A lot of other policy things need to get into place. But we're, I think, particularly interested in fiscal measures because this helps connect some of these things to market. Peter, will you give us some reflections on, well, who might pay for this? How is it going to happen? How are we going to bring it to life?
Absolutely, Alison. So thank you very much. And thank you very much, James. I have to admit, I couldn't agree more with your comment that we shouldn't approach this in a peanut butter spreading way. We, unfortunately, in this particular case, with everything that's going on and the urgency of the problem, we will have to pick winners and losers. So I couldn't agree more with you. So thank you very much. It sounds like you have some pretty solid plans, or should I say pathways, to getting high emitting sectors to net zero by 2050. But I hate to be sort of the penny pinching or sound like the penny pinching finance guy here, but my question is, how much is this going to cost? And maybe even more importantly, who's going to pay for this? So Alison has asked me to answer all these questions in 10 minutes or less. And I think we have plenty of time to do so. So what do you think? So let's give it a shot. Let's start with the first question. How much is this going to cost? So there is all kinds of estimates out there that the global annual cost of hitting net zero by 2050 will be in the sort of trillions of dollars. Now this sounds like a lot, and I low single digit. So, but still like trillions of dollars. And so this sounds like a lot, and it is, but let's put this in perspective. Global GDP in 2019 was approximately $18.5 billion or trillion dollars. And also, I think we should bear in mind that this amount that we're going to spend will do more than just getting us to net zero by 2050. For example, last year, the International Energy Agency published a 3-year, $3 trillion sustainable recovery plan that will not only align with our net zero target in 2050, but it will also create lots of jobs and boost economic growth significantly. So that's the global scale. So how much will it cost for Canada to hit its net zero 2050 goal? Well, I cannot really answer that question exactly, but we do have an estimate of what it will cost to achieve Canada's 2030 interim target, because we do have some interim targets here of reducing greenhouse gases by 30% below 2005 levels. So, by the way, the federal government is now sort of thinking that maybe we could actually go as low as 32 to 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. So, according to a 2020 plan by the Institute for Sustainable Finance, the annual cost for Canada to achieve its 2030 target will be approximately $12.8 billion per year. Like they're actually looking at a 10-year time frame, and it's 128. So you divide that by 10, 12.8 billion. Again, a big number, but to put it in perspective, this amount is about 0.6% of Canada's 2018 GDP. It's about 2.7% of annual province's tax revenues, and it's actually comparable to the amount that Canada currently spends on experimental research and development, which is in the order of magnitude of $12.7 billion annually. And it's about 10% of the annual capital expenditure of all companies listed on the TSX. In other words, a substantial number, but it looks achievable. Having said that, if we wait much longer, the cost may very well become unachievable. Gets me to the second question. So we're on target, I think, time-wise, Alison. Who is going to pay for this? So to some extent, the required capital, a significant extent probably, will have to come from the public sector, such as federal and provincial governments. But it's pretty clear that without capital from the private sector, Canada is not going to be able to achieve its 2030 and 2050 targets. And I would say 2050, no longer we should talk about target, but it's actually close to being a commitment, right? Like we're baking this into legislation. So how are we going to convince the private sector? That's the question, right? We can't force them, technically, like banks, pension funds, asset managers, but also ordinary Canadians like you and I, to invest in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Like Alison said, we're focusing on mitigation, but let's not forget adaptation. Some of this climate change is going to happen no matter what, and we've got to adapt. So in short, the government should act as a catalyst and use public policy tools and public funds to unlock private capital. The government needs to create the conditions that make it attractive for private capital to invest in climate change, which includes things like creating clarity and reducing risk. Like this is a risky business, and companies, capital markets look at a return that is risk adjusted, and so somehow we have to reduce the risk level. So what does that look like? And now I'm actually getting to, and I said I had two questions, but I actually have a third question. How can the federal government unlock private capital, and look at that in a little bit more detail? So the government should use all its tools. Like, it's too urgent. We can't just bet on a couple of tools. We should use all our tools, including policy, regulations, fiscal measures, and direct investment. We cannot just rely on carbon pricing and market forces, as some people would suggest. And again, I'm a free market kind of guy, but this is urgent. Like, we can't just, normally market forces are great, but like now we have to actually jump into action. So first of all, the government should lay the foundation and create the infrastructure by defining what qualifies as green and as transition. There's a lot of uncertainty around that, and you may have heard terms like greenwashing. People pretend it's green, but it's not really. So the CSA group is working on an industry-led initiative to do exactly that, create what they call a taxonomy, but a government-endorsed taxonomy would even be a lot better, actually. And I think the government should play a leadership role. It's also important for the government to set clear standards for climate change disclosure. One of the key things is disclose. We need the information, we need the data. So disclose in line with, for example, something is happening to my connection here. So disclosure, for example, in line with the TCFD framework. The world is already moving in that direction, and we may as well get ahead of it. So with this foundation and infrastructure in place, the government should follow what I would call a carrot and stick approach. So what kind of carrots and sticks am I talking about? Let's start with the sticks. Let's not, start with the carrots. Let's start with the sticks. And those sticks are basically there to level the low carbon playing field. So first of all, you may not be aware, but we still have a lot of fossil fuel subsidies, so we should phase those out. And I'm just a messenger here. According to the IMF, in 2017, Canada spent about $43 billion on fossil fuel subsidies. That is more than $1,000 per Canadian. So that is important to note. So we should also further expand our carbon pricing, and not only by increasing the rate, which the government has promised to do, right? It's going to $170 by 2030, but also by broadening the base. Again, according to the IMF, with only 9% of all greenhouse gas emissions covered, Canada has one of the narrowest bases amongst countries for carbon pricing. So with carbon pricing in place. So that's like really, really low. And then one other thing, I think we should quickly move, and James said we already have the technology, but we should quickly introduce net zero building and retrofit codes. Like there's no time to waste on that. We got to get on with that. So with the sticks out of the way, let's now briefly talk about the carrots to entice private capital investment in climate change solutions. So the fundamental reason for why government carrots are required is to reduce the excess risk associated with investments. I mentioned that earlier. There is excess risks in climate change solutions, investing in climate change solutions. So the government needs to reduce that excess risk and make investment in climate change solutions more attractive for private capital by, for example, co-investment, directly investing, blended finance, for example, in infrastructure projects and building retrofits. Subsidies and grants for targeted, and I think that this goes to the heart of what James said, targeted early stage R&D. We got to pick winners and losers. We got to stimulate that. We got to make bets, and we kind of, they look like bets, but we kind of know where it's going. And then last but not least, tax incentives to support scaling and rapid adoption of commercialized clean technology. So examples of tax incentives, and just looking at the clock, I'm almost done. So examples of tax incentives include things like, I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but we can talk about it in the question and answer period. Things like things that we already have, right? Refundable target R&D tax credits, investment and production tax credits, accelerated depreciation, clean tech patent boxes, right? So if we actually develop clean technology in Canada, we don't want that clean tech to actually then be sold to foreign investors. We want to keep it here. We got to make that attractive. So returns, like in form of royalties on these clean technologies, should benefit from low corporate income tax rates. We should make it attractive. Enhance and think about individuals. Enhance RSPs and TFSAs to the extent that you make investments in green and transition qualifying investments. So that's just to mention a couple. And last but not least, you may have heard about it, flow-through shares. So if we invest in startups that don't make any profits, but they try to attract investors, most of those investors actually have the ability to offset or take the deductions and tax credits against their personal income tax rates, because they actually do pay tax. And the best way to do that is flow-through shares. We've got lots of experience in the mining industry doing that. So last but not least, and all good things must come to an end. As I mentioned, tax incentives are intended for scaling and adopting new clean technology. This means that as soon as a particular technology, clean technology, is widely adopted, we should actually reduce and phase out those tax incentives. Right now, one of the complaints is it's an open-ended blank check type of thing, those tax incentives that are built into the tax code, but we should have a mechanism to monitor whether those tax incentives are still needed. And that would take away one of the biggest complaints that, for example, the Department of Finance has when you talk to them about tax incentives. I'll stop right there, Alison. Hopefully I've stuck to my time a little bit. That's it.
Yeah. Peter, when you were talking, I sort of, in my mind, I was going back to James's chart, one of the last ones he showed us with sort of the different stages of development. I just wanted to bridge back to you, James. I think for a lot of people, as we started to get our heads around transition risk, we were thinking that the main risk was the unpriced cost of carbon. And we started doing projections. Okay, what if firms had to absorb different prices at different rates? And I think your presentation today showed us it's not really about the price of carbon. It's about all that lies behind it, and that carbon tax is more of a tool in this system rather than a sort of a standalone thing. I just wanted to get your thoughts and responses on something like the role of carbon tax and what you've been presenting. And just to say, I've got some great questions flowing through, so I want to move on to those two after that.
So just to answer that one, so I think Peter's points were very good, that we need to use multiple policy instruments. And I think that relates to the fact that the problems, as I said, the problems in the different sectors are different, and they're at different stage of change, the maturity of technologies and solutions. To be honest, I think carbon pricing is more of a backdrop measure that communicates across the economy that we move away from, we're going to be moving away from fossil fuels. But the driver will really be the new technologies and approaches that upend the way we're used to doing things. And I think the electrification of transport, for instance, is really a great example. For years, nothing much happened. And now things are happening very, very quickly as the major auto companies, Volkswagen's probably the most clear, are committing to this pathway. The question is, how do we accelerate it? How do we scale it up? But think about the implications for businesses. Where are gas stations going to go? Autonomous vehicles will come in. What happens to parking lots? I mean, there are big implications for how our cities are organized. And for investors, I get a lot is about thinking, where are we going, rather than just manage, oh, what can we do to manage this? There are huge opportunities. How do you capitalize on them?
I think you're absolutely right. And this is the biggest maybe hurdle for us in the financial sectors. It's not really about where we've been, but it's about where we're going. And here we're only talking about it. We're not talking about the physical risks. We're not even talking about the carbon capture, as you say. We put those sort of out of scope of this study. We're looking at what do we have today and what do we need to do to innovate and change today. I've got some pretty cutting questions coming through. I think in recognition of the importance of the energy sector and the oil and gas sector for the Canadian economy, and particularly in some of our regions. And we're, as you said at the beginning, we're stuck in sort of the pipelines and the debates there. What can we do to pivot forward? There's even a question saying, what would you do if you were a leader of an oil and gas company? What could you do to make sure that you're competitive in a net zero future, if you're competitive towards 2050? What's the path for Canada to remain a world leader in this space?
So this is a really hard question, because you're picking the sector that is going to shrink and whose current business model is not going to work, full stop. I think Canada we're kind of in the middle. There are a number of European oil and gas companies that are a little ahead of where we are, and there are a number of American companies, and then even more companies like in Russia and in developing things that are even further behind. But I think it means thinking about what net zero means for all of your emissions, not just your production emissions, though driving down your production emissions, particularly through, easy one, well, not easy, but an obvious first one is fugitive methane emissions, but driving those down, I think, is really important. The biggest thing I would say is get your head out of the sand. And here, I'm not picking on individual oil company CEOs, but certainly I would say the government of Alberta has had its head in the sand. A lot of this issue was clear, basically clear, well more than a decade ago. How has it changed practice? Getting in front of it, thinking about what does an energy company look like when it's working in a net zero environment, I think is really important. Just quickly, everybody agrees oil and gas has peaked in North America. The demand for liquid petroleum fuels is already peaked here. And if Canada really accelerates a transition towards electrification of transport, imagine if 40%, 60% of the cars on the road aren't using gasoline, 100% aren't using gasoline. What's that going to do to the relative significance of oil and gas in our economy over the next decade, 15 years?
Yeah, and I think even the International Energy Agency came out with a report yesterday making that exact point, James, that in the developed world, we basically peaked, right? So the only growth will come from the developing world, and I think we have to start focusing on trying to get, instead of ramping up the demand in developing worlds, we have to ramp up demand for electricity, right? So try to push electric vehicles and things like that, and not let it go up. If I have a second to answer your question, and I think James has said it, like some of the European, like you're talking about leadership means that you have to look forward. Some of the European oil and gas companies, Ørsted, they've done it, right? Ørsted for sure has done it, but Repsol and a couple of the other ones are definitely way further ahead in actually not trying to hold on to old business models, but they are ahead. And I still think there is opportunity for Canadian oil and gas companies to look to the future and look at geothermal. We have the technology for drilling and stuff like that. We can still get into the hydrogen business, and not necessarily the blue hydrogen, but it can also be the green hydrogen. By the way, in your slides, James, I saw that hydrogen, you did that in a blue little circle. I was wondering whether that meant anything or not. But it is about, like, leadership means looking forward. That is what leadership means. And I think we still have the opportunity to do that. But some of the Europeans are not a little bit ahead, they are way ahead. And you talked about Volkswagen, has nothing to do, but like the funny part is sometimes out of like a disaster, something good can come, right? Like, so Volkswagen was messing around with diesel, and so they have really reinvented themselves. And there was an article, they're buying from a Swedish battery company. They're buying for billions, like tens of billions of dollars in battery. So they're on the right road. I'll stop right there.
And maybe just to pivot forward a little bit as well. I mean, I think looking at your report, I think financial firms are both, looking at how do we manage change and risk. But how do we be a part of the solution? And I've got some questions coming in, and I know, James, you spent a lot of your time actually speaking with policymakers, trying to inform, trying to inspire, trying to bring solutions. There's some questions here. How could the financial sector, where there's a lot of expertise, especially in sectors, and there's a lot of expertise, and there's some visions about where this could go. How could the financial sector sort of join into this movement and support this, be a part of the dialogue and be a part of shaping the future? And from your perspective, I know you've got that ongoing dialogue with Parliament.
So I think obviously I think Peter explained well that the financial sector must be a critical part of the solution. And I think there are many, many things, but I would say that from the outside, a lot of people feel that the financial sector has kind of been passive, maybe not the insurance industry. And of course, there are firms that have really distinguished themselves. But I think reaching out to entrepreneurs, to groups involved in net zero technologies and things like that is really important. I mean, one example that I think is Peter mentioned retrofits of buildings. So that will be critical. We use, about 13% of our emissions come from buildings, which is largely heating and cooling and water heating and so on. Most of the building stock that's out there today will still be standing in 2050. Its energy performance has got to be dramatically transformed. We have to get rid of natural gas, fossil fuel produced natural gas in heating, which either means electrify heating, particularly with ground source heat pumps, or it could mean perhaps renewable natural gas in some circumstances, or hydrogen. But that needs to be begun now, plus retrofits for the building envelope and so on. So right now, the way it works is government gives individual subsidies. You can apply to get $5,000 or $10,000 to retrofit. It can't be like that. It has to be mass retrofits. Right. These 10 square blocks of Toronto will be retrofitted. our 150 commercial buildings in this city will be retrofitted, or the whole portfolio of this company will be. And to do that, you need investment vehicles, because the banks have no interest in loaning people $10,000 to do this. It has to be packaged with an investment vehicle that can mobilize hundreds of millions of dollars for phased retrofits. So in this decade, we will do this many 100,000 million structures. In this decade, we will follow forward. And there are many examples of that, of scaling things where finance can play a critical role. I mean, that's to say nothing, obviously, of financing industrial startups and new technologies and so on. Vehicle charging stations. In Europe, we have examples of companies and models for vehicle charging that are being rolled out at scale that involve serious investment funds that, again, whether it be pension funds or banks, there are possibilities to develop vehicles to support these transformation. We will need hydrogen pipelines. Someone has to build them, someone has to financing. The heavy goods transport sector haven't even got into, and so on. Yeah.
As we come into just our last 5 minutes, and a question for both of you, thinking about where we are in this pandemic. Actually, we don't know where we are in this pandemic. Feels like there's light at the end of the tunnel, but it could be a long road still. A lot of work to try to couple a green recovery or advance some of these transition goals with the stimulus and the recovery that we hope that that is on the horizon for us in Canada, but globally. What are your thoughts? What are some of the low-hanging fruit things we can do in the short and immediate term, or maybe need to happen in the short immediate term, but low-hanging fruit things that could be a part of building back better, stimulating the economy, getting our job rates back up, getting Canadians, engaged back in the economy. What are some of the low-hanging fruits, just as we come through our last sort of 2 minutes or so of this session? Maybe James and Peter.
Well, I think one that we've dwelt on already is the kind of retrofit market for building renovations and things like that. It relatively employs a lot of people, and there are opportunities there to develop skills in the workforce and to deploy that at a larger scale. I think there are a number of clean energy options that are worthy of investment. Interlocking provincial north, south, and east, west grid connections, energy storage technologies, deployment of renewables, accelerating the phase out of coal in the provinces where it's still being used. These are all examples of kind of energy sector things. I think Peter mentioned geothermal, hydrogen production. There's a window for Canada here. If we get in now, wait 10 years, it's too late. And typically we wait too long because we're dithering. But as with electrification, we need a battery plant. We need to build out the supply chain for EVs. Yes. We need both green and blue hydrogen. And again, there are huge opportunities for the investment community with the governments helping de-risk initial investments and so on. But it's there now. They won't be there in the same way in a decade.
And I think this is what you're pointing out. This is a competitive issue for Canada and an opportunity to really pivot and use our natural resource endowments, use our sophisticated financial system to sort of move us forward. Peter, last comment, just 1 minute left.
Yeah, I was just to build on what James was saying, and he was talking about the retrofit building, but there is also this adaptation issue. And I think you can actually combine those things, right? We cannot forget about adaptation. And to James's point, from a skill building perspective, this is something I think is low hanging fruit. There's people ready to go. We can deploy lots of people, and it helps both protect us against the impact of climate, violent weather, and at the same time we can sort of package that with mitigation by making them more energy efficient. So I think that those are great ideas. And again, I mentioned this International Energy Agency report where they actually laid out a plan. It's a bigger plan, but it's a $3 trillion plan for 3 years, and it actually talks about stuff. And it talks about creation of jobs, and it talks about economic growth. But Canada has a fundamental problem, and that is we are not very innovative, and our productivity is lacking. And so I think we have to get off, and we know how to spend money. We've seen that. So, like, let's do it. This is the time to actually take some bold action and stop talking about it. Like, the plans are there. James has done a great job, like, laying it out. It's just a matter of getting there.
Sure. Thank
that's the last I want to say.
Thank you so much for ending us on a high note and an action note. I think that's the point. We need to energize our community. I can't thank you, James and Peter, enough for sharing your expertise.